Okay, so the results of the poster competition. First, let me just thank all our poster delegates because it was a really fantastic turnout and some really great work that's been shown off with the posters, and some great lightning talks were done as well. So we had a prestigious judging panel, apart from me. Sorry. But some real, the big guys in simulation were involved in judging this. They were impressed with all entries, but we did have a unanimous decision as to the winner, which I think is probably a first in operational research. So I'm very pleased to announce that the winning entry is Police Demand Modelling and Predictive Positioning for Effective Service Provision by Joanna Lee from Loughborough University. We thought you were very advanced for where you are in your PhD. It's great work. So you've won, there'll be a small Amazon gift, and there'll be a certificate from the OR Society in the post, so you just need to let me know your contact details. And we thought you might like a picture with the great
It also happens to be from Loughborough University.
We'll put a little something in the OR Society newsletter about it.
So you need to now come out and discover being president. This is what you spend your life doing: is shaking your hands and smiling. So we now want to shake hands.
Right, well thank you very much and well done. The closing panel. It's a tradition with the Simulation Workshop that we have a panel on something which is in the sort of news in our global society. At the Winter Simulation Conference there was a lot of discussion about simulation analytics and, well, what is it? And there were some views put forward that it's going to revolutionise everything, and other views put forward, well, no, it's another fad. So I assembled from a lucky group of potential panellists, i.e. four, a group of 4 panellists to do this, and I'd like to thank them for preparing a little bit of material to get us all thinking about this, and without further ado, I'll hand over to the first one. Back.
So I'll confess that I stole a bit from the piece that I said at the Winter Simulation Conference. So when we're thinking about simulation and analytics, it seems to me that there are at least 2 ways to look at it. One is, how was simulation going to interact with, benefit from, add to the use of big data? That's not what I'm going to talk about. I'm really talking about on the other side, which is why it is that we don't think about output analysis from simulation as analytics. Pardon me. I think, and I'm thinking discrete event stochastic simulation here, as opposed to the way I believe we do treat it, which is as queuing theory. So that's the basic premise here. If my voice will hold up long enough to do it. So I claimed at WSC that there's been sort of a follow the leader kind of relationship between queuing theory and simulation. So queuing theory is usually credited to Erlang, 1909, modeling the Copenhagen telephone system. It's hard to say exactly where the kind of simulation we do starts, but there's pretty firm agreement that Talker's book, The Art of Simulation, in 1963, was the first real system simulation book of the sorts of things that we're still doing today. And he had 2 full chapters dedicated to how do you simulate queuing systems. Right? So clearly that was a motivation even in that book. Queuing theory is useful for getting rough-cut, long-run average measures of performance of stationary processes. So Little's formula, L equals lambda W, standard result for queuing theory, provides a high-level summary of system performance. Now, if you look at some of the first textbooks written about simulation language, 2 of those, GPSS and QGIRT in the US, right in the preface of the book, you can see them talking about queuing theory as providing the paradigm around which they designed the simulation languages. So that was in the back of the minds of many of the language designers when they were first building the initial simulation languages. And of course, the early applications of queuing theory were to telecommunications and manufacturing, and clearly we share that same sort of legacy, right? The early applications telecommunications and manufacturing. So my question is, how should we view simulation? Certainly, lots of folks that I know would say, well, we can get the same kinds of results as queuing theory, but we don't have to assume exponential distributions. And I think that's a fairly limiting view of what simulation is. Why is it we don't say we do data analytics for systems that don't yet exist? Right? Analytics is about processes that already exist on which you collect data. What we do, I'm going to claim, is, or can do if we want to, is analytics on systems that don't yet exist. So simulation as Back to the Future analytics. So what does data analytics do? So here's my one-paragraph summary of analytics. Data analytics explores vast quantities of transactional data to discover anticipated and unanticipated relationships. And the emphasis is on conditional statements, prediction, right? Being able to look deep in that data and find out interesting kinds of relationships, not all of which you knew in advance. Now, simulation generates vast quantities of transactional data, but I would claim that what we tend to do with it is we throw away all of the simulated inputs to avoid finding relationships to the outputs. We average everything across time to mask time-dependent effects. And we create high-level summaries so we can't examine risk. You already heard that from my initial talk. It's as if, and I think this is a legacy from queuing theory, we think we should know everything we're going to want out of the simulation model before we run it. But what if we treated simulation just as a data generator and output analysis as after-the-fact analytics? Now, when I gave this talk at WSC, I didn't confess to the fact that I actually did work for the Obama campaign doing simulations. I figure I'm out of the country now. It's all right for me to do that. In 2012, the Obama campaign had, by precinct, that's the voting unit in the U.S., lots of data on overall turnout, the percentage of turnout expected to arrive by each 15-minute interval of the day, and they believed they had voting time distributions as a function of things that were on the ballot. What they were concerned about was to make arguments that polling places, the places where we vote, were adequately staffed so that people didn't give up because of long lines at the end of the day, right? You're supposed to be able to vote by 8 o'clock. It's still a 3-hour wait at 8 o'clock in the evening, and so you just give up and you don't vote. And so what they wanted to do was to put some quantitative horsepower behind making arguments to the voting commission about the staffing levels that they needed to have. Now, if you attacked that problem, thinking of simulation as queuing theory, what would you do? Well, these are the kind of standard things you would do. You would say, okay, for a given arrival rate, what's the average waiting time and average number of voters in the system as a function of the staff level we put in? What's the utilization of the poll workers and the voting booths and machines and so on? And the only part that would sort of be simulation-oriented is, oh, I want to make sure I make enough replications that I actually estimate those things pretty well. I claim that if you thought of simulation as analytics, you would approach that problem in a completely different way. You'd ask questions like, what are the dynamics of a multiple precinct shared voting booth system? Is there an interaction between the delay to check in and the time to vote? How long does it take to recover when the voting booths get swamped? How sensitive is delay to the actual turnout that we see? What's the time-lagged effect of a 2 standard deviation surge in voter arrivals? And how far before the peak load do delays start to get long? And the particular question that I'm going to look at on my last slide is, how long should someone who's voting after work expect to have to wait to get to vote? Now, here are the kinds of plots that we produced, which I think is a pretty easy plot to understand. Along the bottom, you can see the staffing level that was used in the simulation. In the middle there, you can see a measure of the expected load in terms of voters. And then there are 2 bars here, and each bar represents a 15-minute time of arrival. So it's the 15-minute window in which you arrive to vote. And the red part is how long you waited to check in to prove that you actually were allowed to vote. And the blue bar is the average time that it took for you to complete your voting and get out. Right? And so you can look at this and you can very clearly see that sort of time-dependent relationship. Now, we know we could produce this with simulation, but I want you to think for a minute about how difficult or how much work you would have to do to make your simulation produce this result. Well, you'd first of all have to say up front, oh, I want to do this. I want to know results by every 15 minutes, that people arrive. And because people don't necessarily depart and arrive in the same order, I've got to make sure to tag all of those voters when they arrive in my simulation so I can put their waiting times back in the right bucket, right? Because I'm trying to say something by arrival time. Now, we could do that, but that's a fair amount of work, and then suddenly, after the fact, if I ask you to say, oh, I want to zoom in on this half-an-hour period, tell me more about what's going on in there, well, it's completely rerunning the model again. On the other hand, if we simply saved every single transaction that occurred during those voting simulations, which is still small data by current big data standard, then we can go back and ask any question we want. We can easily produce this plot using the timestamps from when the people arrive. But if we want to slice it and dice it another way, if we want to zoom in on any particular time interval, it's easy to do after the fact. And so my contention is that this legacy from queuing theory is that we think we need to know what we compute up front, and we instrument the model to compute that. I think we get a lot more out of our simulations if we simply save everything that's produced, every transaction, every timestamp, everything that happened, and then use the tools of analytics afterwards to examine the data. Hey, our data will be clean, right? We don't even have to do the data cleanup that most people have to do in analytics. Okay, that's it.
Simon has this beguiling way of getting you involved in these things. He phones you up and says, you don't need to do anything other than turn up and answer questions. then there's a bit of a sudden realisation that some slides might be useful. Right, so I've got two perspectives. There's a bit of a danger that we might all agree all the way through this. I have to say that I agree with everything that Barry said there, and I've similarly have two perspectives on this, and I'm actually going to talk about them both. I don't know which one Simon intended this to be about. And first of all, simulation improves analytics. So here I'm talking about analytics as being OR. Everything that we know as operations research is analytics. The two words go together. The only difference is that analytics tends to be done with vast amounts of data, with big data. So it's OR with big data is what analytics is. But the interesting thing is that it's historical. It's what did happen. You're doing data analysis on vast data sets that's come out of some website or Facebook or wherever it is, and you're looking at what's happened, how people behaved, and it needs to be predictive. And this is how simulation helps. If you take a data set from the past and you stick it into your simulation, you can then start to ask questions about it. What if I change some important variable, like I don't know, the price I'm charging, or the number of servers I've got, or whatever? Or what happens? Or what happens if something changes that I can't control? You can do some analysis from the past data and predict what's going to happen in the future, and simulation does that. It also needs to be, you also need to do some sensitivity analysis, because there's lots you don't know about that big data, and you might be making some assumptions that are wrong in some way. So with simulation on that big data, we can do some sensitivity analysis, and we were talking about the cloud this morning in this room. Perhaps if we use the cloud, we can automate that and give people predictions that they didn't know they needed to look for. So I'm really passionate about that. I think simulation actually brings analytics to life. If it was being used on some of the big data projects now, it would actually make the big data able to predict a lot more than it is currently being used for. And I think we're going to see a lot of use of simulation in that field. However, I don't actually think that's what Simon intended us to talk about. That's one of my perspectives. The second is analytics inside simulation, and again, I agree with what Barry has been saying. We are not, as software vendors, I don't think we're providing this now. And the sort of talks that we've seen during these 2 days, a number of them have mentioned the need to produce displays that really help decision makers answer the particular question they're trying to answer, rather than just give them our standard data or some nice looking charts of standard information out of our simulation runs. We need to be focusing the displays in ways that actually help answer the particular question that people have. Now, there's been lots of this in the past. I mean, umpteen people produce Excel front ends and back ends on simulation, and you can put all sorts of things into Excel. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about interactive ways of exploring the data, as Barry said, that's already been collected as the simulation has run. I mean, that's a screenshot of some results that typically come out of simulation. You can chart these things, but it's a whole load of confidence intervals. And frankly, how is that going to help a decision maker decide what they want to decide? It's not going to. So the sort of thing that I mean, and how easily you can see this, is something that we're playing with. We added this into Simulate a couple of years ago. I'm not trying to pretend it's the answer, but it's the sort of thing that I'm talking about, and it needs a lot of extending. Those of you who've seen a tool called Google Analytics, the name of it I hate because it implies it's doing analytics. It is a little, but it's all about exploring the way visitors to your website use your website. And it's a great tool for companies like ours because we can look at how people move around the website and work out how to improve it. We should be providing the same inside our simulation tools so decision makers can explore their simulation. So you get this sort of chart here that's giving you an across-time picture of what's been happening, and it's giving you key measures that are probably going to be useful to you, like highlighting the worst bottleneck, highlighting the highest utilised activity, the longest queue, and then lets you explore those things. So when you click on something, it shows you that, it lets you drill down into that and look at the data behind it. Automatic charting of the top 10 bottlenecks, so you can see what's going on in them. When you do a whole series of runs, looking at different, exploring different parameters, actually telling you for each of your top KPIs how they change. So you can quickly look at this and say, well, I can get the red performance indicator to increase, but only at the expense of the blue one going down. So you can easily see your last 10 experiments and compare them. That's the type of thing that I'm talking about. So just finishing off, we want to have good displays. We want to focus the simulation building on the decision that's being taken rather than just getting the model built. And going back to what Simon was saying this morning, we should probably be doing some sort of automated sensitivity analysis via the cloud. So they're my two perspectives on simulation and analytics. Thank you. Number 3.
Okay, good afternoon. Okay, so quick outline is what does analytics mean to me? Where, in particular, does analytics impact simulation? And what are the opportunities and challenges for the simulation community? So, some of the things that I think about when I hear the term analytics are things like machine learning, high performance computing, visualization, text analytics, and all the things associated with big data, so including data mining and all these good things. Although there's another phrase that sometimes worries me, which is data science, and this always rings a little alarm bell because, as many of you are probably aware, there are some, if you like, we might call them extremists at the sort of far end of the spectrum who seem to think we can just do everything with data, and we don't really need models and statistics and simulation anymore. And that's obviously quite an extreme view, which we need to be very wary of.
You're stood right in front of the projector.
Oh, I beg your pardon. Thank you. I'll stand over that side, that'll be easy. Here are some of the ways that some of these different aspects feed into a typical simulation view. So here's our system data that we're collecting. Then in this arrow, we're basically doing some input modelling to generate our input model. That then feeds into our coded simulation model, and together with some kind of experimental design, we generate a set of output data. Then we've got our output analysis going on to hopefully generate some useful results, insights, and conclusions. And so obviously some of these things have more than one impact. So things like visualization, machine learning, high performance computing, they're affecting both the input and the output side. Some other techniques, things like text analytics, probably really only affecting the input side. Things like data farming, predictive analytics, affecting the output side. And then techniques like Bayesian networks, I think, have an increasing role to play. Again, here both on the input and the output side. So input modelling, big data, is it a help or a hindrance? Well, probably a bit of both. Yes, it's nice to have lots more data, but we know we have to clean it. We know that some of it may be censored, some of it may be not in the format that's immediately useful to us, the simulation modelers. And we still have to extract useful information from that big data to help build our input models. And it's not always as easy as I say, some of the people on the far end of some of the data science spectrum would suggest. Data-driven simulations are not data-driven. It's a combination of data and models, and we always have to remind them of that. One area that is relatively unexplored still for simulation is text analytics. So there's a whole range of untapped sources of data out there, loosely structured documents, social media data, and so on, which we really tend not to use in simulation. But of course, agent-based simulation, very often focusing on social systems, could make great use of that, identifying perhaps social networks to help propel social models, epidemic models, traffic flow models, all that kind of thing. Again, dependencies within the model, dependencies and dynamics, we need to identify these. So again, I'm suggesting things like Bayesian networks could be very useful. That gives you a nice compact representation of your joint input distribution. And of course, big data also creates a temptation to include ever-increasing levels of detail in our simulation models. Well, we all know we need to guard against excessive detail just because it's possible. On the output side, as Barry said, simulation increasingly being used to generate its own big data, or relatively big data. This is the impetus behind things like data farming. Again, particularly important with agent-based simulation. And okay, data farming maybe it's just big experimentation, but it's giving a nice resurgence of interest in experimental design, particularly sequential experimentation. Visualization, say a bit more about that. And again, Bayesian networks, another something I'll say a bit more detail about. So data farming experimentation is really crucial. As Barry mentioned, just to be a sequential approach rather than just trying to do everything in one big bang experiment and then analyse the output. Let's try and use the experimentation time a bit more cleverly. And one just simple example, maybe we just do a two-stage experiment, where in the first stage we do some factor screening to identify which of the factors are most important, which ones are less important, and then we can analyse the most important factors with additional levels within the factors, maybe in something like a Latin hypercube design, very efficient for large-scale computational experiments. So that's one example of making the experimentation a bit more sequential. As Barry and Marcus said, visualization. Increasingly, people, users, consumers of simulation are going to expect the simulation to have much better, much more interactive visual outputs. And it's going to be no good just plotting scatter plots when we've got millions of points involved. So increasingly we may need things like heat maps or contour maps for big data. We may want visualizations which help to tell a story, and things like string graphs. And obviously our graphics, things like our charts, are helping us to make data more visual, more interactive. And we can also maybe use some useful insights from psychology here. Some visualizations work better, draw our eye to the right part of the graph in terms of the story that we want to tell. We can maybe even use visualization more proactively to make sure that the client actually goes away with the right message. Maybe get the visualization to prompt certain questions that we would like them to ask, so that hopefully they go away with the right kind of insights. And some good work we've done in Finland recently on Bayesian networks for output analysis. So again, as Barry said, if we generate the output and save it, then let's interrogate it. Bayesian networks and dynamic Bayesian networks, very useful for observing, for example, the time trace of a simulation over time. And we can then ask inverse questions like, well, if we observe the real system in a particular output state, what's the most likely combination of input factors that led to that? So this kind of thing, very well supported by Bayesian networks. So I think there's a number of challenges for the simulation community. Some on the input side, representing high-dimensional dependencies during input modeling in a better way, tapping into large textual data sources. And then on the output side, certainly making much better use of visualization, trying to make sure the customers, the clients, go away with the right lessons. And increasingly, we are undoubtedly going to see simulation used to facilitate more real-time decision support. And that can be very, very powerful, potentially a big growth area for simulation, but I think we also have to be a little bit wary. We don't want people to automate simulation into black box approaches. Okay, that would be a real danger for simulation. We all know there's a lot of art and subjective judgment that goes into building a simulation model. We need to keep the human analyst in the loop. That human analyst generates a lot of understanding about the system through the process of building the simulation model. What if the client is actually asking the wrong question? Well, a black box isn't going to tell them that, but the human analyst just might. So hopefully the future for simulation is bright, and let's hope it's also bright for the simulation analyst, and we don't end up with a situation like this. Thank you.
I hadn't realised quite in and out being the last person behind three very prestigious people in simulation who of course are going to come up with all these great ideas. So I apologise if I repeat pretty much everything that has been said before, but I agree with everything that's been said before. So anyway, this is my take on what the simulation analytics and the future of simulation analytics, and I've come from it from a slightly different angle, I think, from other people. So I sat down and thought, simulation analytics, do I really know what analytics is? No, not. I've got an idea, but I'm not completely sure. So of course I did what every good student did. I went to Google, I typed in analytics, and then I clicked on the first link that came to hand, which was of course Wikipedia, and looked up what analytics was on Wikipedia, and got a good first kind of impression from there. And that gave me a few ideas, and based on that and what I knew already, had a look through it. And these are the kind of buzzwords that came to mind when I thought of analytics. So first, social media, business intelligence, web science, so everything, kind of data connected with the web. Non-numeric data, so this was pictures, text, my little essay about quick brown fox that I was typing in to get some text to put on here. Massive complex data. Google came up because I think they've got quite a lot of responsibility, I feel, for the term analytics. They seem to have certainly helped make it more popular. And that was what I saw as analytics, and then it was trying to work out how simulation fitted into that and how we got to simulation analytics. Of course, being at an OR Society conference, I also looked at the links with OR, and this was my Venn diagram. I was trying to work out what the overlap was between OR as we know it and analytics. And I would say I don't think they are the same thing. I think there are bits of OR that people wouldn't call analytics, and I think there are bits of analytics that people wouldn't call OR. But I think the overlap is pretty huge, and simulation would fall somewhere on the overlap. So I guess my question is it something new, something we're worried about, or is it just an unasked for rebrand of operational research? Should we just rename ourselves the Analytics Society? And I think there are differences, but I think there's certainly scope for rebranding some of our work as analytics so that we can sell it to different people who wouldn't necessarily know what OR is. When I was looking at this, I looked at kind of the history of OR and where OR started. And OR kind of brought together all these new disciplines and started up because there were these big questions that needed answering, like how do we get people into war and feed them and move our armies around and various things. So big questions and things that followed on from that after the war had finished. The reason I can see that analytics has sprung up as this new area is we've got this new challenge of lots of data, the massive, complex, unstructured, and generally just weird data that's there in terms of the text and photos and things. And weird in the sense that no one's really thought that hard about how to analyse it. So I think that's probably why analytics has started up. The fact is they're using quite a lot of techniques that we've probably had in OR already, so that's the question, is it something new that they're doing, or are they just using things that are already there? So after I got my head around a bit what analytics was saying and what it was, and also why it had started, really, just thought about what does it mean for simulation? And my argument is I don't think it means, so far, certainly in the academic community, it hasn't meant a huge amount for simulation. I did a search on all the winter simulation papers for analytics and came up with 2 papers that had analytics in the titles of them at Winter Simulation Conference. One was written by a consultancy company, and one was some work which did involve the university, and IBM were involved in that. I also searched, and the JOS editors might be interested in this, for analytics in the Journal of Simulation, and absolutely no results. So I did a search through the journal website, no results whatsoever. So far, on the face of it, analytics hasn't had any impact really on simulation at all. Now, I'm not sure, given what Barry said and everyone else has said, I don't think that's true. I think we've still used some of their ideas and have the potential to use some of their ideas. But to date, I don't think they have been used. And my worry is if you do a search for something like analytics and simulation at the moment, you're not necessarily going to come up with any of this work which could actually be branded as analytics and could be useful for analytics. So it might get missed. So I think there's something we maybe need to do if we've got something that looks like it's going to be useful to all these big data, massive data problems, then we should have analytics as a keyword and analytics in the title. Otherwise, these communities that don't know so much about simulation might miss what we're actually doing. So what will it mean for simulation? I think this sounded quite fun, this simulation of weird data. I mean, people have talked about using text data and things as inputs for simulation. Will there come a time when we're generating text and generating, I'm trying to work out how you could generate photos using a random number generator, but that was kind of beyond me. But will we be needing to simulate this weird data to do things with our models? Will our models have changed? The other thing it might mean is this move away from process modelling, from kind of almost queuing theory type modelling, to things where there's more networks, there's more interactivity, you've got people talking to each other in the models, all the entities are interacting. this would be quite a big change, kind of move away from maybe some of the discrete event simulation that we've done. And then this has been talked about by, I think, everyone else on the panel, this analysis and display of massive data sets. So there's quite a lot we can learn about how to display them in simulation. So in conclusion, I'd say maybe analytics is just a rebrand of things that we do already, but applied to another application area. And my theory is let's work with it, see what we can learn from it, see what we can do from it, but make sure that the people who are doing it know what we're doing. And focus on the problems rather than the names and the techniques that are best to solve the problems rather than working out what they involve. So I would go for and I'm going to steal this blatantly, as all academics do, steal blatantly from people. So I'm stealing from Barry, but I'm acknowledging that I'm stealing from Barry, and coming up with my badge, which is what Barry did in his winter simulation paper. But yes, I love analytics because I think it's going to generate some really interesting problems. So I'm going to stick my badge in here and have my I love analytics badge. So that's all I have to say.
Brilliant, thank you. And you've just given me a perfect idea for the giveaway in volume 9 of the Journal of Simulation, the Art of Analytics badge. So, great range of opinions. And as I would expect, there's some convergence, but also there's the counterpoint of whether or not it's just a rebranding exercise. So, and also, I think Chris actually captured the modelling and simulation community perfectly, which is massive, complex, unstructured and weird. So, could I take questions from the floor for our panel?
I agree with Barry's approach to actually approaching the data coming out of the simulation. You can't know beforehand, particularly if you've got a simulation based upon emergence, which I think is Chris's point in terms of heading towards the weird. Know what's going to be interesting. You need to actually study it, which is where I feel analytics comes in. Where I get alarmed by what I've heard is in relation to notions, for example, of ethics, because any fool can distract someone, particularly through how one psychologically plays them in painting a picture. And to some extent, I feel that we need to be humble in terms of our understanding, transparent about the strengths and uncertainties of what we do, and also careful in terms of our underlying validation and our notions of completeness for a purpose. Otherwise, we're, to my view, going into very dangerous territory. Happy to elaborate, but interested in your views.
Well, maybe I can pick up on the ethical part, because maybe it's what I said that you really picked up on there about the psychological use of visualization. All I really meant by it was that it's very easy to show visualizations where people actually take away the wrong message. And we need to be aware of that. So things like star charts, for example, psychologists have been able to show actually people star charts can be very useful for visualizing multivariate data, but people often neglect maybe the bottom left quadrant. They put more emphasis on the top right, so unless you're rotating it, people are going to miss some useful information from the data. So if we're aware of that, we can make sure it doesn't happen. So really I was talking about from the point of view of let's make sure that important lessons aren't lost, because we're aware of the problems in some visualizations as well as the benefits.
And as far as being aware of it, and apologies, I didn't mean it to be an attack, absolutely agree. Nonetheless, I believe that interpretive piece that leads to the visualizations needs to be something done in community with our customers. And even though, as we do work, we necessarily form beliefs, actually we need to be able to step aside from them as far as we're humanly capable, and to surface more views in that interpretive piece, so that the visualizations that come as a so what are actually founded in the broader community view and not simply reflections of our own biases.
Anyone else?
Yes.
Well, so I'm going to just step right into that one, I think. I'm not sure how well we do that now, but one thing I think for sure is that if what we provide people is pre-cooked summary reports of standard sorts of things that mask a lot of the actual behavior that's going on, then we're not serving people very well as it is. On the other hand, if somebody can say, well, I don't really understand the way that you displayed it there, or that's not the way I would like to think about it, give it to me this way, slice it this way, give me a different look at it, then we've at least built in more flexibility for somebody to actually be able to tell us the way they would like to look at the data, or the way that they would like to see it. So, I mean, I don't, you know, I wouldn't defend what we do now, but because I'm not sure we do all that well in terms of the interpretive piece. But I certainly think what's going to happen with the emphasis on analytics is people are going to expect more, right? So if because that's what they're going to see from their data analysts, right? From the people who are analyzing their customer data and other things. And if the simulation can't answer the same kinds of questions, then the simulation is going to look weak as compared to the data science. And I am concerned about things that were only driven by data, when there's no, thought about the modeling. So I think we're going to be pushed to doing this, and I guess in some sense I think it's fair, at least if it's possible, to redisplay, to reslice, to look at it in different ways. That at least provides more possibilities, to be fair.
And that's a strong cautionary remark. But at the same time, we do need to be careful, or to work on ways of communicating quickly with busy people, but at the same time to be transparent about what has been improved and what hasn't been, so as not to unintentionally mislead.
To touch on the points that Cicely discussed, but perhaps from a more practical point of view, I think I agree very much with what Barry was saying initially about keeping all the sort of information from the summation. But for me then, I think the next issue is actually how you actually visualize and display it. And I'm reminded of a display which I saw, must have been about sort of 10, 20 years ago, which I was never able to sort of pin down, which some of you might know. And it's what I would call a drag and drop display. What you had was basically an Excel spreadsheet, and with all the data files stacked up in a sort of folder menu on the side. And what you could do is you just simply drag one of these folders and just drop it in the bare box, and it's immediately displayed for you. And you could mix and match, because it takes some different data files, just drop them in, and they'll all be immediately sort of displayed in a sort of meaningful way. You could manipulate the graphs and plots in any of those sorts of ways, really. And that seems to me to be exactly the right sort of tool to have, which avoids some of the concerns that Paul was sort of saying about sort of putting a particular slant on display. And particularly for sort of discussions with executives, it seemed to me to be such an excellent tool. I was never able to sort of get hold of it, but that's something which I feel that though Excel is good, the word displays are very rigid, and it's just so quick. I mean, it really was just drag and drop, and it's just a wonderful tool. So if anyone knows of it, then please let me know, and I want to get hold of it.
Have a look at a thing called Tableau. I'm not sure it goes quite as far as you're saying, Russell, but it's certainly definitely in that direction. It's a very easy way of displaying lots of different data, and on their website they've got huge numbers of examples that they create from public data, so you can see the sort of thing that you can do, and you can change it live on the website in their examples.
Well, that would certainly seem to me to be the way to be actually moving the visualization and the analysis side, and particularly for busy executives. And if, as Barry was saying, you want to see some other slant to it, then having a tool like that, it just takes all the weighting out of it, really.
I do think we need to be doing that. It's also worth people having a look at, and I don't know how easy this is, but if you've got a website that you own, have a look at what Google Analytics can show for it, because that's an example where it's not a demo, it's a very specific task you've got to do. You want to get people who come to your website to look at the pages you're keen for them to read, and it really does help you visually understand what you're getting wrong, and in the same sort of way lets you chart things cut and slice and chart things in different ways to see how you can improve performance of it. And if we put that sort of thing onto simulation engines, you can see how it would help decision makers get to the heart of how to change their business.
Question from the back.
I guess I have a question about to the panel on giving the customer or the person who's looking at the results freedom of using data analytics and visualization tools such as Tableau to investigate for themselves in the way they find meaningful. One, it sort of, I guess, gives them the ease of not being a specialist in different stats techniques. They'll play around with it so they can kind of get nice pictures. But two, it gives them a way of just investigating what the simulation is doing in different steps. I guess what are your views on that, and whether that's a dangerous thing to do?
I think there's pros and cons. Yes, it can be dangerous because they can take away a wrong message, but it can be equally dangerous if you force them to look at it one way. They can also take away the wrong message. I think we have to give flexibility because different people will some visualizations will suit some people better than others. So once people become acquainted and familiar with a particular visualization and can interpret things very easily from that, then that will be their favourite visualization, but it may be very different to someone else's. So I think we can't just offer a single way of looking at it. We've got to have flexibility, and this is very much what the visual analytics community are trying to do in producing flexible visualizations. If you Google visualization conferences, there's a whole stack of them out there. It's really one of the big areas for analytics, and we need to try and import some of that, I think.
Kind of connected with my question, when I teach simulation to MSc students, I always tell them to think very hard about the performance indicators they choose in terms of collecting data, because you want to speed up the runtime, you don't want to collect a lot of unnecessary outputs. But if you're saying, actually, let's collect everything and save everything, so because we don't actually know what questions we might want to ask until we've got all this massive output data, then that raises questions obviously for the software itself, because you need to be able to efficiently save all this data in a form that communicates. But then also the output tools that you provide for the software that guide the user to, or the analytics expert that then comes in and advises on the simulation or the use of the data. So maybe we shouldn't be telling students to think in advance about what you want to collect. Just collect everything and then.
Maybe the thing you've got to tell them to do is to build the model with the decision question in their mind, but then collect all the data. Then you can play with the data afterwards.
One of the things I would be worried about is that a situation, for example, if you had a number of replications which you do in simulation, but you choose to look at one of them that gives you the answer you're looking for, and ignoring the other 99 or 99,000, which is what some of my users have done in the past. This one looks good, we'll go with that. And you've missed the whole point that you actually...
Yeah, maybe we need to be storing all the data, so you don't take into account the fact that they're different replications. You put it all into a database. It's all data about how that system was performing in all sorts of different weeks, and then they've got to look at all the data, and it's no worse than it would be taking data off a website and looking at how it performed last week.
One of the things let me just say that I particularly liked about the display that you showed is time-dependent effects are so often what I think we're really interested in, right? And that's the part that we so often get rid of, it seems to me, and that's a strength of what we do. Right? We can model time-dependent effects, and so it's nice if we're able to call that out.
Yeah, I'm a bit confused about collecting all the data, because if I'm running a simulation model of, say, departure of concourse Terminal 5, and I've got 50,000 people coming in each day, we'll go through that, but, and I'm sort of taking data of every time they do something, you're going to be absolutely massive with how much do I, it's a question I think you would create, it's seeing the wood for the trees. I think there's a danger if we can create such a big data set. Now maybe that is how do we then analyse it, and that is... Another comment is, I don't know if it helps at all, I think pivot tables in Excel are brilliant. You can pivot, pull data around and see what's going on. And I often now, if I've got a client who's reasonably savvy with Excel, I give them Excel data with a pivot table and say, well, drag as you like. And they're learning and finding out about the system. I'm just wondering if there's a sort of something we could learn from there, sort of from a pivot table type of approach. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that each textbook in simulation will tell you that a model should be purpose-built. So if you collect all the information that you can, you might be driven away from the purpose that you initially built the model for, because you can play with the data too much, and the model in the end might not be valid anymore. So I think there is a danger if you collect and use everything without always thinking about the objectives that you build the model for.
But that's the difference between the modeling purpose, which I do. I certainly teach that you build the model to address the decision questions that you have in mind, and I completely believe in that. And I don't think anything we've said here changes that. The problem is after you've seen the results, you might have different questions. Right? There might be different things that you want to see, and yes, we don't want to drift off and lose track of what it was we were doing because the software is pretty, but this is the world in which we live. This is what people are doing with big data. People are going to be better at it, actually, because of that. So I'm less worried about that.
Should the simulation industry actually focus on analytics at all, in the sense that I agree with the approach of writing out transactional model data, and you should use as much real data as you can. For example, don't record whether you hit or miss certain level, but write out how long it actually took to complete a certain process. But will we not always be behind the actual analytics industry? We touched upon Tableau, other packages like SW14 and so on. They really specialize in visualizing your data and analyzing it in a statistical way. I'm pretty sure that when we add a feature to any software, the customer will come back and say, well, I wasn't interested in just queuing time. I was interested in the sum of the queuing time and the process time. So isn't that the stuff that the analytics software is already doing very well? And are we not being distracted if we try to do the same thing in simulation software?
Well, I'm not a software vendor, so it's easy for me to say. I don't see why we should do it. Right? We do the modeling and we generate the data. Let's use the strong capabilities of SAS and other sorts of things to analyze the data. I agree with you. I think we'll always be a step behind if we try to do that. It's not our key strength.
I agree. Years ago, we put some charting facilities into Simulate, and then as soon as you do that, people say, but you haven't got the 29th chart that Excel's got. Well, okay, use Excel then. I think it is right that we should concentrate on doing the simulation and let Tableau or whatever do the analysis.
I think it's probably important to know that the data that we are generating is in computer simulation is contextual, because it's generated using a model with certain assumptions, and it's designed for a certain purpose. So there is a danger if you don't include this metadata into the output data that people may misinterpret the results. Well, okay, we got all the numbers and we just analyze it blindly without knowing the context. So it's probably tied in nicely with the usability issue and things.
I think Stuart mentioned this in his talk earlier today on conceptual modelling, wasn't it? That you can create a very simple model which answers a specific question, but if you ask the wrong question with that model, you'll get the wrong answer. But will the people asking the question know that they're getting the wrong answer? Will they know they're asking the wrong question?
Yeah, I think a comment first and then a question to the panel. We keep discussing the replications, and that's come up quite a few times throughout the workshop. I think from my experience, some of the best projects I've worked on is actually looking at a single replication and not actually taking the average of results over hundreds of reps. Because the customers pointed out one rep, said this is my lowest throughput, and actually if these three events occur, then it really affects my throughput. So we've analysed that as being a worst case scenario, and they've actually tried to prevent those events occurring, so that we've had an improvement that way. But a question to the panel. The title of the discussion is Simulation Analytics in the Future. Is this the future of simulation? I think over the last kind of 20, 30 years that the market for simulation hasn't actually grown that much because, well, queuing theory and simulation is quite complex and quite highly skilled. Do you think that analytics actually opens the market for simulation to a broader audience?
Yeah. Why is it turning that way?
I think if analytics is on the increase and you get more people who know stuff about statistics, which if you get more people doing analytics than before, then yeah, if they know more stuff about statistics, they'll know more stuff about how to analyse simulation models. So yes, I would say it might increase the market that way, and increase the number of people who want to use it. But I think simulation also needs to broaden out what it can do from your basic kind of process model to things which people are interested in and things which the analytics people are interested in terms of networks and social networks and modelling all of these kind of interactions as well.
You know, in the US, we've had a tremendous growth in master's programs in analytics. And it's interesting where a lot of the folks that are being attracted to those programs are. A lot of them are what you would expect of engineers and statisticians and folks who got undergraduate math degrees. But what it's doing is, in the US at least, is a big shift from kids who might have gone on to get an MBA, who are moving into analytics, which is much more technical, right? Much less management focused. And why is that? Because industry is demanding these kind of people. They want people who can do analyses. And analytics, the term has a broad meaning to many people of anything that involves math and computing to help me run my business better. So I don't see how that can do anything but help simulation as being a part of those kinds of tools. There's going to be a demand for better analysis.
A lot of the questioning is focused on the output analysis side, but some of the comments you were making were around the input side of big data, input to simulations, and I know you said directly, but there's a question there to me that most of the discrete event simulations I built, that we're involved with, even quite large models, do not consume large amounts of data. Certainly not big data, volumes of data, and certainly not data of different types. It's all pretty much numbers that we stick in there. And I just wonder, and this perhaps goes back to a discussion we had 4 years ago, but how much this sort of idea, and Christine, you mentioned it around modelling networks and so on, pushes us away from using discrete events towards a more agent-based approach, because that seems quite natural to lend itself to the ideas of big data and modelling individuals, and would consume big data to run the model. Have you got any comments on that? And Sally, you can kill me because you wrote the paper DES is alive and kicking. So.
The thing is, I don't really see much difference between DES and agent-based. No, I mean, there isn't, and I think the more data there is, the more discrete event or agent-based can make use of it. I think one of the things that's changed dramatically in the last less than a decade is that the days have completely gone where you go into the client and the client says, the trouble is I'm going to need to collect some data. Now, that doesn't come up. They've always got vast amounts of data ready for you. That's changed, and we should be taking advantage of that.
Can I make a comment that, which is I agree, and I think a lot of what we're doing is taking a lot of data and summarising. So typically, you take a lot of data and you summarise it into 3 parameters for a distribution. And that's very different to taking a lot of data and simulating it. So actually saying, and I agree, I think agent-based discrete event is a sort of continuum, and there's too much made of these differences. But a model where, say, I'm modelling tens of thousands of individuals, and I'm not pre-processing the data, but I'm actually making them interact in the model, is quite a different idea to pre-processing data and summarising it before modelling it.
And are you saying we should not do one of those?
No, I'm not saying no. I'm just saying, does it shift us more to a world where
We can actually use the real data.
Yeah.
Yes, I think we should be. And we've seen some recent cases where we have done that, and it's been quite useful. As we keep saying, data changes over the day or over the week, and there's a big danger of just summarising data that you'll miss that in the input data as well as the output data. I think there's also, related to that, because there's so much data available, you can start to see how you can automatically build models. So you can take transactional data from people who don't really understand their process, and you can mine that information and turn it into a process flow. So because you've got so much data, you can start to do that. Well, we're thinking they don't necessarily have to. We think there are things you can do with vast amounts of transactional data to surmise from it what the process is, even when people don't understand the data themselves. The word "think" in that sentence is quite important at the moment.
So someone is
One of my friends at work has done a lot of big data stuff in medicine. And one of the big problems they were looking for rare side effects of drugs, and one of the big problems they had is false positives. So huge numbers of false positives. We haven't mentioned anything about that. Is that something, I can't get my head around if that's something I should worry about in simulation output or input, because it is different. It is modelled data. It's not empirical, and we know what's going on in the simulation. So are false positives something I should worry about or not? Yes or no answer, please.
now.
I'm struggling to think of a context in which it applies for the output of a simulation.
So no.
No,
I don't think it's an easy. I know it's something that comes up a lot in big data. So
You mean some sort of spurious result that's actually an artifact of the data rather than
or an artifact of the model,
really happening,
maybe,
yeah.
and we're sort of reporting on this is really an important transient effect, and it's just because of the way we've structured our model.
I think that is quite an important point when you're coming to generating all this data and not answering the questions that you originally set out to do. Is we've got quite a lot of work on validation, verification of simulation models, how we use them now, but if you're coming to use them in this sense and you've got all this data that you've generated, but not really quite knowing what the question was when you generated it, how do you validate that what you're doing here is correct, which is similar to...
There's a thing as well, isn't there, that in a simulation, within the model, it sort of knows a lot more than you would in reality. It's predicting when things will happen, and they are precise predictions. You know, for example, you sample the time to failure, so it gives you that it will fail when this component has flown 10,973.5 hours. If you take that information from out of the model at the wrong time, before it's actually failed, then you are using information that you shouldn't actually know. Yeah?
Yeah, I mean, you should be able to pick that up from model verifications. I mean, you should still be doing verification of your model. If your model is doing something that's innately nonsensical, doesn't correlate with the system.
If you're outputting masses of information at the wrong point of time, you know, you've sampled the time to failure. If you write that out at that point, you could use that to imply that you would be able to do something different, operate the system in a different way to avoid that failure from happening, which you can't.
But does that just mean you haven't sampled for long enough?
No.
Well, you're talking about using information that you wouldn't have in the reality. I don't think anyone's suggesting that. That would be
No, I'm not saying I'm just saying, how do you avoid allowing that to happen?
Well, I think it's part of your verification and your validation. It can't happen in the real world, so why is it happening in our simulation world?
I think what you're saying is you avoid people treating your output like empirical data rather than
Yeah.
model form of evidence. Is that what you're saying?
Well, you could make inferences, but people ask me, well, when's it going to fail? I say, well, I don't know. I can't tell you. But the model could. This particular component is going to fail at this particular time, in 10 years' time. So why can't I just take it out of service the day before so it doesn't? And it's something that I've had to face with users quite a lot, is that they seem to think that you can, because you're using numbers in that way to predict things, that you actually know. And it's... So, yeah.
I come in support of Mark's statement that I have used transactional data in order to infer process in that particular case using the tactics database then held at the staff college as my comparator. So I believe it can be done, I believe I've done it.
Yeah, just thinking, I think it's quite related to what I asked you this morning, Terry, about the automatic input modeling algorithms. Because I think that maybe there is now some situations where actually the real system can produce more data than we could handle, not just for the input, but for validations. I don't know, how do you foresee this kind of practice in the future? It's not just for Paris, for everyone. So we can see that we have a simulation model of a real system. Usually what happens is in traditional ways, we collect the data and then it's a snapshot of data and then build a model, run the simulation model, get the analysis done. But nowadays, probably we are more interested in kind of symbiotic simulations where the real system and the simulation model, they run side by side, and this can produce significantly more data than what we can handle.
Well, I don't know if this is exactly what you said, but I thought this is the point that Stuart raised a minute ago. And to me, given the kind of research I do, I find tremendously fascinating because we have come from a paradigm where we tend to fit distributions. And I argue for fitting distributions, and I understand the reasons for doing it. But I don't know. If I've got, this is what I said to you this morning, right? If I've got 500,000 data points, do I want to smooth out that bump that actually appears in the data by putting a distribution on it, when maybe that bump really is something that's actually there? On the other hand, do I want to use that data with no smoothing at all? I think these are hard and interesting questions. The issue that we can now talk about, one of the things we do very badly in simulation, so let's say that. One thing I do very badly in simulation is modeling dependence. Right? Customers have all kinds of different characteristics, and they're clearly dependent on each other. But if it gets very high dimensional, I don't really know how to do that. Modeling dependence is really hard unless it's pretty low dimensional. Hey, if I can actually replace that with actual customer characteristic data, then I've implicitly modeled the kind of dependence that's there, and we may well have enough data to be able to do that, or resample that data in some sense. But where we should end up on there, I think, is a research challenge. I think that's a really interesting research question of how do we use big data on the input side of what we do. It's not as simple as just saying, oh, I'll just read in all the data that I've got. At least it doesn't seem to me to be that simple.
You're saying that there's massive amounts of data, but there's not always in every case. For instance, if you take my area, times to failure of aircraft engines, uncontained failures, Rolls-Royce has had one in the last 15 years because it does a lot of work to avoid them. But does it do too much? Is it over-engineering it because it's only had one, or is it under-engineering it because it's had one? Yeah. Getting data on things that on times to failure of things that don't fail is very difficult.
Very fancy simulation.
things like visual analytics again. Is there a potential process change in the simulation model verification validation process by using visual analytics? So you can do the simulation of a very complex situation. You can try and verify as much as you can and validate as much as you can, but if the actual data starts showing some erroneous data, can you use visual analytics to start drilling down into why that special occurrence happened? Is it something natural of this model, or is it something that's programmed incorrectly? And is there the converse risk of people who use visual analytics on your output identifying that, okay, your model is a bit questionable in this area?
There are those risks, but maybe if we're working with the big data community, they're having to deal with these risks as well, and we'll learn to treat them with the same caution as the big data community has to treat them. And ultimately, the data we've got is never going to be perfect, and it's much better that we're modelling with imperfect data than not modelling at all. I mean, I completely take your point. We need to guard against that, and we need to research for ways of avoiding that type of problem. But it's not a concern that I have that makes me think, oh, we better not do this.
Is it a benefit of doing it to help validate some of the data as well? Simulation?
Yes, but how are you ever going to validate whether this blip in the data should be there or shouldn't be there? I don't know the answer.
Maybe the answer is, if it's there, then this is what will happen. If it's not, if it shouldn't be there, then this was what's happening.
Yes, I mean, that's often the way we in the simulation community treat rare events. You do have to model them because you need to understand how to cope with them. But actually, if you just have them appearing in a model at random, they can really throw you off the scent about how to manage the stable state.
I mean, I mentioned, to my mind, things like Bayesian networks, dynamic Bayesian networks are underutilised. People are beginning to realise they can be useful also for the analysis of simulation output. So if you have a particularly interesting part of your output that you want to say, well, how did it get like this? You can basically instantiate that state as a piece of evidence in Bayesian network model and update your probability distributions of the other factors, including the input factors, which will give you the most likely combination of things that led to that particular observation. So you can then ask, is that sensible? Is that a reasonable set of conditions that would have led to that output, or is there an error in the simulation model? I think it would help them diagnose that type of problem.
Okay. Oh, sorry. One last question, I think.
I just want to raise a quick point concern about, like, if we have learned as a beginner that the model is approximation of reality, and we try to model something with simplification and assumptions. That's what we know about the model. And then we parameterize the data because that's what we have been doing. But if we come to the prioritization, you already discussed that, no, we should move towards more and more real data, which is really big and things like that. So how does it make it really different from the people who do years and years of analytics analyzing that data? I'm just wondering, like, if we really move in, really spending so much time in that data thing and not really parameterizing or really simplifying or just using distributions, for example. So are we then not moving from a bit from like approximations and modeling and simplifications and things like that, which we just do to collect a direction of where should we proceed? So, no, just that.
I think what you say is quite interesting when you're talking about having these big transactional data sets, using those to generate your model, and then your model producing some more big data and analysing that big data, and you've not really got that human involvement in there. Then all that you're doing, an analytics procedure, is just a bit more complicated than your standard, a cluster analysis or something like that. So I guess then simulation becomes an analytics tool to a certain extent.
Yes, but the extra thing that's in there is that it is a model that can show you how the dynamics of the dynamics of the relationships between the variables work. It can show you that, and it can let you change some of the factors and then use that real data to predict what will happen in the future with the change that you're putting in place. So you're adding another server in. How would this big data have been impacted by the extra server? That's an extremely simple example. There's much more complex dynamics in real models. But so that's the difference. Just because we're using big data doesn't mean to say we're not doing any more than what the big data people are doing.
In our master's program in analytics, and this is standard, we didn't come up with this, but we think of analytics as having three pieces, right? Descriptive analytics, predictive analytics, and operational analytics. Clearly, we fit on the operational side, right? I don't think of us much in the descriptive side, and we certainly have the potential contributions in the predictive side. But I think it's that operational side, it's the ability to change things, the ability to do what ifs is where our real value add is.
One last question.
Yeah, I'm aware of the time, so just one quick question. I have to say, one of the panelists here actually taught me simulation.
And we have to guess which one.
I do remember him saying at the time, keep your model as simple as possible.
And I still say it.
Now we know the answer.
Data, real data and big data, it doesn't mean that fundamentally big data and simulation is incompatible.
No one's saying use all of the big data. We're still saying you have to extract the most useful features for the kind of questions that you're going to answer. So a lot of it will be rejected. This is irrelevant detail. So no one's saying you're going to use all the big data.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the questions. I'd like to thank the panel for their responses and the presentations. Thank you very much. And I guess as one half of the management, I'd like to bring the workshop to a close. I think we don't have anything else, do we? No? So, thank you very much for coming. I hope you all enjoyed it, and see you in 2 years.